Hi, this is Bill, and this is Progpaganda. Over the course of our last dozen or so episodes on this channel, we've been reviewing our list of proto-prog albums, the 25 albums released in the late 1960s that were a guiding influence to the genre of music that we now refer to as progressive rock. In our first episode of that series, we went through the list of 25 albums complete and provided the criteria through which we identified those 25 albums for the list. If you haven't seen that episode and would like to check out the list, you can do that at this link. Over the course of the last several weeks, and as I said, about a dozen episodes or so, we have drilled down on various of the albums in detail, covering albums to this point from the years 1965, 66, 67, and 68. If you've missed any of those episodes or would like to go back and check them out for any reason, definitely go back and do that. We think you'll enjoy what you see. Certainly if you watch and enjoy this episode, definitely go back and check out some of the others if you haven't already done so. Today's episode covers a landmark album of the psychedelic era from July of 1968. It's the Moody Blues album, In Search of the Lost Chord. The Moody Blues were, of course, one of the more significant bands of the late 60s psychedelic era, releasing 4 albums over the course of the years 1967 through 1969. Of those 4 albums, 2 of them are, for me, particularly significant. In Search of the Lost Chord, the album we're discussing today, and the album that preceded it a year earlier in 1967, Days of Future Past. Our criteria for building the list of proto-prog albums specifies that an artist can appear on the list only once. And so I had something of a decision to make. And it wasn't an easy decision to make because Days of Future Past is a very significant album in its own right. It's one of the first albums ever in the symphonic rock genre. It's also an early example of the concept album. It is the first album on which the Moody Blues classic lineup, featuring their then new guitarist and singer Justin Hayward, and their new bassist and singer John Lodge. And it's the first collaboration that the Moody's did with the producer and engineer that would work with them on their classic string of 7 albums between 1967 and 72. The producer, Tony Clark, and the recording engineer, Derek Varnels. I ultimately selected In Search of the Lost Chord over Days of Future Past for 2 reasons. The first reason had to do with public impact of the 2 records. In 1967, Days of Future Past established the Moody Blues as a band to watch. It did moderately well in the English charts, peaking at number 27. The story was different in North America. The album, while it received critical praise, did not make much of a dent on the charts at all. That would change several years later. In late 1972, the Moody's record company, DRAM London Records, elected to release a song from Days of Future Past, Nights in White Satin, as a single. And the single did very well and ultimately catapulted the album onto the charts, peaking at number 3. But that was 5 years later. Initially, the album in North America didn't really do very well at all. By comparison, in 1968, In Search of the Lost Chord would peak on the British charts at number 5, and on the North American charts and Billboard at number 23, which was a rather strong showing for a British band that didn't have any hit singles off the album, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. The second thing I felt was significant was the music itself, in particular the arrangements and some of the more non-traditional rock and roll instruments that were used. On Days of Future Past, of course, an orchestra was employed to create some of the vision of the concept. The London Festival Orchestra, conducted by Peter Knight, who also realized some of the arrangements based on the Moody's music. That music is interesting, but at least to my ears, those arrangements are a bit dated. They very much remind me of the easy listening orchestral music that one would hear on FM radio back in the 1960s. It has not really worn all that well. On In Search of the Lost Chord, by comparison, the music was arranged and realized by the band themselves, employing a wide array of instruments based on the liner notes on the album. Some 30 or more instruments were used by the 5 members of the band in order to achieve the sounds that you have on the album. This perhaps was something of a curse to them later, because ultimately the band would need to recreate the music on stage, and using such a wide array of instruments with overdubs in the studio made that difficult to do. It was a lesson that they would learn on their later albums to try and keep things a little more simple. But nevertheless, as far as what was created in the studio, In Search of the Lost Chord was a very triumphant record. It's an interesting record also by virtue of its content. The concept of the album is one of spiritual searching and enlightenment. The Moody's, sometime after the release of the album, were not secretive about some of the inspiration behind the album. They made use of a fair amount of marijuana and LSD over the course of the sessions in order to achieve their visions and to assist with bringing their visions into musical form. And some of the music is very interesting indeed. 2 singles were released from the album. The 2 songs chosen were those that were felt to have the greatest commercial potential. Ride My Seesaw, written by John Lodge, and Voices in the Sky, written by Justin Hayward. Either of the singles, at least in North America, did very well. By comparison, the album's keystone songs are longer pieces by different authors. Specifically, Ray Thomas's Legend of a Mind, which is bookended by John Lodge's special effects piece, House of Four Doors. And then, to close the album, Mike Pinder's song, Om, which is one of the most beautiful pieces of psychedelic era music created, at least in my opinion. Mike Pinder was a master of the mellotron, which is used to great effect on Om, along with Ray Thomas's flute. The Moody's, by virtue of their interest in spiritual enlightenment and their use of drugs when they toured America in support of the album, made a point of meeting and visiting with Timothy Leary. And Ray Thomas and Mike Pinder in particular maintained long-term friendships with Leary, including during the period that Leary was imprisoned for his evangelism around the drug LSD. That is, in fact, something that Mike Pinder immortalizes later in the Moody's catalog on his song from Seventh Sojourn, When You're a Free Man, which is about Leary's incarceration. All things considered, this is a beautiful and brilliant album in terms of how it's constructed. If I were asked to introduce someone to the music of the psychedelic period, this is one of the albums I certainly would choose to do that. It's a great record, and one that formed a foundation for the music that the Moody's would do over the course of their next several years together. That's all for this episode. If you enjoyed what you saw here, please click like below. Please subscribe to the channel. We will be doing quite a few more of these shows covering the remainder of 1968 and 1969 over the course of the next several weeks. So please stick with us, and we'll work to bring you some great entertainment going forward. Thanks for your attention. See you soon. You take care.